you very much. Thank you very much. My presentation is about Tahirih and her poetry. And I would like to talk generally about Tahirih Qurratul Ain as a figure in Baha'i history and Baha'i imagination, and point out some of the gaps and difficulties which we've had with Tahirih as a figure. Tahirih is obviously the most famous of all Baha'i Babi women. She's more well known than any other holy figure who is a woman in Baha'i history, and she also is quite distinct in her approach and her behavior from all other Baha'i women that we regard as important and sacred. The wife of the Bab, for instance, Abdul Baha's wife, Munira Khanum, even Navab, the wife of Baha'u'llah. All of these women, though in their own ways were quite distinguished, also remained within their traditional gendered roles, kind of stayed home, did the hospitality and the knitting and so on, and did not break out of these roles, except for the greatest holy leaf, Abdul Baha's sister, who for a brief moment, at the passing of her brother Abdul Baha, really became the head of the Baha'i faith, but was quickly overshadowed by the guardian after a couple of years. So Tahirih is distinguished for her, her outrageous behavior, her traveling around, her direct confrontation with the authorities of the time, her imprisonment, and her martyrdom. And Baha'is have not really come to terms with her personal life or her personal choices. Baha'is kind of treat Tahirih gingerly. We regard her as a saint. We regard her heroics as very inspiring, but actually very little has been written on Tahirih by Baha'is. The only biography of Tahirih which has been written, let me see if I can get this in the right place, is by Martha Root, Tahirih the Pure, this book here. And that was written in the 1930s, and it's still the only biography of Tahirih which has been produced by Baha'is, which is rather odd considering how important Tahirih is in Baha'i imagination. There is this other book which was put together by Falaki, Tahirih and History, which is simply a compilation of very short pieces that have been written by Baha'is and non-Baha'is about Tahirih, in which we can piece together a certain history, but no one has done it very seriously. Abbas Amanat has been threatening to write a biography of Tahirih for many years, but he hasn't done it. And so her life really remains unexplored. Partially, this is because of how maybe dangerous her life is. She, after all, divorced her husband, abandoned her children, though she probably didn't have a whole lot of choice with that one, but challenged other Babi leaders, invaded male space, demanded that she be heard, and so on and so forth. This kind of audacious behavior is not something that Baha'is and Baha'i women even today are very comfortable with, but something which is obviously defines Tahirih as a figure in Babi history. She is the most radical and the most audacious, even challenging the Bab himself to go further and further with his claims and getting out in front of him, actually, when she's in Karbala, the very famous and amazing story of on the first day of Muharram, the Shi'i period of mourning for the martyred imams. Tahirih on the first day of Muharram in Karbala suddenly realized, well, wait a minute, the Bab was born on the first day of Muharram. This is the Bab's birthday. This is a day of celebration. And so she, instead of going to the traditional mourning ceremonies in black and wailing and crying as she was supposed to do, and everybody else did, she dressed in bright colors and brought sweets and went to the Rosa Khaneh and distributed these candies and said, why are you crying? This is a day of celebration. You should be joyous and happy. And that caused a riot in her neighborhood, and she was arrested and deported. So that's Tahirih. And now the Bab had never said she should celebrate its birthday, but we do it now. And she was the first one, and she was out ahead of everybody. Anyway, what I'm saying is that Baha'is have not really had the courage to explore her life very carefully, and there are no academic monographs on Tahirih by Baha'is or anybody else. I think Amin Banani wrote an article which was published in the Journal of Baha'i Studies some years ago about her. That's about it. Anyway, I want to discuss her poetry as a source of her thought and theology. You can interrupt me, by the way, at any time while I talk. I tend to go on and on, so you have to stop me to protect yourself sometimes. But this is the book, Tahirih, A Portrait in Poetry, that I'm going to discuss. This is Amin Banani's selection and translation of Tahirih's poems. These are the poems, by no means an academic divan of any kind, but certainly his selection of what he felt were the most likely to be the authentic poems of Tahirih, based on his study of Iranian poetry and literature and his study of Tahirih's poems. They have never been collected in any systematic way, and all of the provenance of all of these poems is suspect. There's no way for us to really know when these poems were written, or whether, or how they were collected, where they came from, or how authentic they are. The narrative we have of Tahirih's life says that before she died, she knew that she was going to be executed. As a matter of fact, it was quite obvious, and she even has a poem written about her anticipation, which is quite telling, because, and this is another digression, sorry, because she says that she was visited by a judge and a priest, a qadi and a mullah, who were giving her final chance to recant her beliefs. She was by then a prisoner in the house of the Kalantar, the mayor of Tehran, and she had been there for 2 years. And they said, okay, this is it, recant. And she wouldn't. So obviously she knew that very shortly she would be martyred. In her poem, she writes, a priest, a judge, and we speak of love. But what can I teach to fools? And that's, that's her understanding of this Inquisition. Anyway, probably all of the poems that we have collected were written after the martyrdom of the Bab and in the house of the Kalantar, where she could collect them and compile them. And she apparently told the wife of the Kalantar, to which she had become very close, that after she died, a woman would come to pick up her things and take them away, a Babi woman. And in fact, that did happen 2 days later. And we don't know what happened to all of those things, but some of them were her writings and her poems. Anyway, with that as a background, and this is a lot of this is speculation, of course. Dr. Banani, when he's writing this book, makes a distinction between Tahirih's words and her voice, which is very interesting because, of course, Tahirih wrote many learned Islamic treatises as a Babi, using her enormous erudition and learning to argue for the cause of the Bab. But these are traditional Muslim treatises that look like any other Muslim treatise, except they're Babi. And it's very hard to distinguish her writing in that sense. But her poems are something else entirely, in which she has no reference to learning, and she's relying entirely on her inspiration and the movement of the spirit to produce these poems. And according to Amin Banani, this probably represents her better than the kind of traditional enclosed treatises that she had to write as a Babi scholar. She was completely educated, as was her mother and her grandmother, for that matter. Her father had a madrasa for women that he maintained, and he educated her in the highest tradition of Islamic learning at the time. But her poems are Sufi love poems, entirely different and separate from that sort of tradition of ulama learning. And she has these two aspects of herself that are very interesting, very fascinating, actually. She has this disciplined, learned side, and she has this outrageous, passionate, transgressive and absolutely, untamed side of her as well. And this comes out at the conference at Badash, where she, to the horror of Qudus and others at the conference, just proclaims the end of the Sharia and throws off her chador and says, "That's it, guys. It's over." And even climbs into the same carriage as Qudus without a veil, which is absolutely scandalous, and recites poetry as they go off together into the sunset. So we're talking a very courageous woman. Anyway, I have given you all the short paper that I wrote about her poetry, which is very preliminary and which I haven't spent any more time on since I wrote it a few years ago. What I want to focus on is her her use of the verse in the Quran, which Todd Lawson is so attached to, and which he has now attached me to also, of the day of our last, the day of before creation, the day of pre-existence, in which, what is this, Todd? This is Quran 7:172 or something. Don't quote me on that, in which God, before the creation of the universe, calls before himself all the souls that will ever be born and asks, am I not your Lord? And they all reply, thou art. The word Bala in Arabic meaning yes, or certainly, yea, verily, or thou art. Now that is not a prophecy. That is a statement, a beautiful statement actually, of the unity of humanity before creation. It's a story of pre-existence. We all know about the prophecies that the Bab is supposed to have fulfilled, and Baha'u'llah talks about them in the Kitab-i-Gan and so on, that are about the prophecies of the end of time, the coming of the Qiyam, the end of the age, and the coming of justice and peace that will bring the world together and so on. But this is a story of an entirely different type of pre-existence. And of course, the Tahirih uses these prophecies of the coming of the Qiyam, but she bringing them into the present, bringing them from the eschatological future into the present and activating them. At the same time, she goes back to pre-existence and pulls the story of our last into the present and activates it as well. And I find that fascinating. Todd Lawson has done much more work on this than I have with regard to the Bab. Let me show you his book, which I have here. That's not it. Where'd it go? Okay, Todd Lawson's book, Being Human, in which he has essays where he quite often refers to this story of pre-existence in the Quran, as does Tahirih, and she regards this as a present moment. Now, my eyesight is extremely poor. I'm going to try to read a couple of passages and then I'll be finished in a moment. We can have some discussion of this. But it needs light and glasses and the whole thing. But she says in one of her poems, which is quite ecstatic, Fars, that means Persia, Fars. Fars is set aflame and Tehran's burning. Pure spirit rises from his place. Start dancing. At daybreak, nightingales don't sing. The cock struts forth. And birds of glory start praising. When my lover asks, am I not your Lord? Even the gods reply in awe, thou art. And here we can see her lover being God, the spirit, the Bab, whoever. She regards as her lover, and as he speaks these words of pre-existence, the creation in the present moment responds. And in another place, I don't know if I can read this well. When the brilliant sun of your face first dawned, You dazed me by your light at my day's start. So speak the words. Am I not your Lord? My heartbeat will reply, thou art, thou art. You ask, am I not? I said, yes, thou art. Then disaster set up camp inside my heart. Actually, I can never read that. I can never read that line without crying. So this idea of bringing pre-existence into the present and bringing the eschatological future into the present at the same time creates a kind of mystic now, which becomes Tahirih's present, and her abandonment of self for this moment. Okay, so I don't know how much time do I have here? Kabian, help. Do I have any time left?
You're in good time.
Oh, okay. In that case, you get to hear her famous poem, Point by Point, which is her signature poem. The important thing about this poem is that it ends, apparently it's addressed to the Bob, though it's not easy to tell. But it ends with the union of Tahirih's spirit with the spirit of her beloved. And in many of her poems, actually, she identifies with the spirit, she identifies with God or as his lover, perhaps, and then becomes one with him. I mean, erases the distinction between God and herself. This obviously is a Sufi trope, but in absolute violation of Muslim limitations, which she had no use for whatsoever and would have discarded in a heartbeat if she wanted to. And when she wanted to, she actually did. And so this poem is no different. It ends with her finding the Bob and herself to be one in some mystic way. I have to grab my glasses again. Here they are. Sorry, this is Point by Point. At least that's the title we gave to this poem when the book was published. Point by point. If I met you face to face, I would retrace, erase my heartbreak, pain by pain, ache by ache, word by word, point by point. In search of you, just your face, I roam through the streets, lost in disgrace. House by house, lane by lane, place by place, door to door. My heart hopeless, broken, crushed. I heard my heart pound till blood gushed from me. Fountain by fountain, stream by stream, river by river, sea by sea. The garden of your lips, your cheeks, your perfumed hair. I wander there, bloom by bloom to bloom, rose to rose, petal to petal, stream, scent to scent. Your eyebrow, your eye, and the mole on your face. Somehow they tie me, trait to trait, kindness to kindness, passion to passion, love to love. While I grieve with love, your love, I will reweave the fabric of my soul, stitch to stitch, thread to thread, warp by warp, woof by woof. Last I, Tahirih, searched my heart. I looked line by line. What did I find? You and you, you and you, you and you. So here, Tahirih ends by finding, we will say at this point, the Bab inside her heart. I suspect at this point the Bab had already been martyred, and that this poem was written in the home of the Kalantar and was rescued after her death. Okay, that's it for me. Questions or comments or ideas are welcome. Objections, whatever.
I wanted to jump in and say real quick, there's a performer, a writer, singer, songwriter who lives in a community near me, Roxana Haddon, who does a musical version of that poem, Point to Point. It rends the audiences into tears. It's just powerful, powerful stuff.
Yes, it's been put to music many times in Iran, and not necessarily by Baha'is. It's just an extremely powerful poem on many levels, of course, as a love poem, but also as a surrender to the spirit.
I note that when you went through the work that had been done on her, it was restricted to the works in English.
Yeah.
That things like Nogobai's book were left out, which is basically, I think, a compilation of sources on her.
Yes, I'm familiar with his book, but of course I can't read it, so I can't say much about it. But even there, among Iranian Baha'is, there was a tremendous reluctance to pay too much attention to Tahirih, simply because she was a woman, and not a traditional woman at that. So they were a little, and still are, a little hesitant to pay too much attention to her life.
I take objection to this. I think Tahirih is extremely popular among the Persian Baha'is and non-Baha'is. And also the amount of work that has been written about her is unbelievable. Perhaps with the exception of the Bab, there are more stuff written about Tahirih than anybody else in history of our faith. I recall at some point in communication with Nujan Momen, he wrote to me that was saying there are more than 1,000 books and article has been written about Tahirih. And if you want to do some research and work, I suggest you pick up some other figure. Otherwise, there are plenty of stuff was available. The other point that I like to make, the confusion that has been about which poem belonged to Tahirih, which does not, really started, Tahirih herself was great orator and great writer. By the way, her writing is much more superior than her poetry. And those of you who can read Persian, you can always go to Fazl Mazandarani or Muhammad Hosseini and find hundreds of essays and articles and correspondence that Tahirih had with different figures, especially those Babis or those Azalis who did not as necessarily Babis, who were against her. Tahirih would start to lecture, and at the middle of her talk, he began to recite some poetry by somebody else. And as she was going along, she would add her own work to it. And she would finish her presentation with mentioning her name at the last line, which was popular in the Persian poetry. So the confusion started that even the beginning and everything else belonged to Tahirih, which was not. But I think Amin Banani himself has mentioned somewhere that about 50% of Tahirih's poetry are original and belong to her, and the rest belong to Mahallati and a couple of other contemporaries of Tahirih.
I couldn't make any sense of, when I wrote my article, which is in that compilation, which Tony pointed to, I just couldn't make, I dabbled with her poetry a bit. I couldn't make heads or tails of her theological works. They were just too difficult, way too difficult for me to manage.
Yes, they are extremely specific, esoteric, and within that sort of shaky tradition of Islamic scholarship. And the Bab wrote in a similar fashion, actually. So that I don't know how accessible her academic work will ever be to the general public. Her poems are immediately accessible to the whole world, actually. Even in translation, they're just stunning. Yes, Baha'is have written much about Tahirih as a saint and as a, kind of heroic figure. Serious work on her life is something else. In terms of an academic exploration of all aspects of her person and her history, still even putting together a chronology of her life is a serious problem.
Okay, Nemo and then Shola, please.
Tony, thank you for this presentation. I was really touched at the sentiment that the underlying sentiment you shared with it. It was very heartfelt. I just wanted to echo something that Adib brought up very timely. Dr. Mohammed Hosseini, I think probably I'd go so far as to say has probably the most comprehensive volume, albeit it's in Persian, on the biography of Tahirih. It's a survey of all of the biographical sources we have on Tahirih, her prose writing, so her intellectual treatises addressed to Muslim audiences, her letters, correspondence with some prominent Babis, to groups of Babis, and her poetry. I recall in a couple places, I don't have the page numbers handy on me, but he does discuss poetry that is attributed to Tahirih, but we're not quite sure, or there's precedent that he mentions Faiza Kashani, who is a prominent Muslim scholar and poet, and says there's a poem that's been attributed to Tahirih, which is very, very, very similar to something that Faiza Kashani had written almost point for point. And I think we'd really benefit. And according to what Adib mentioned earlier, apparently that volume is being translated into English. So if that is the case, I'm very excited. I really hope that that comes out soon. And yeah, I thought there was something else I wanted to say, but I found your presentation very touching, very informative. Thank you.
Have you had a chance to read the volume, Hosseini's volume?
You know, I've used it for reference for a couple of questions and a paper I wrote last year for one of my courses that I was participating in. But I haven't read it thoroughly cover to cover. I have a very bad habit of buying books and actually not reading them from cover to cover. I use them a lot for reference purposes. But it's on my reading list, certainly, to go from cover to cover. And I really hope that, and his volume on the Bab, I do hope we see them available in English sometime in the near future. That'd be such a wonderful service for the whole world. Thank you again.
Tony, your presentation was just wonderful. Thank you so much. And I should also say thank you so much for the volume of translations, which I have used in classes year after year, and generations of students have just fallen in love with her and her poetry. So thank you so much to you and dear Professor Banani for that. And actually I would add Susan's article as well, has been really wonderful. I just have a footnote to what you presented, Tony, and I think there's a couple of articles, even if we set aside the very important Persian scholarship, there's a couple of articles in English that maybe haven't received the attention that they should. And these are two pieces by Mujan Momen on the Badaghani family, which sort of helps us understand the context in which Tahirih operated. And I guess I would characterize her as a scholar activist, or maybe a professor activist, because she taught in that Salihiyya madrasa in Qazvin, and so did her mother, who was a poet. And these articles by Mujan talk about Tahirih coming from a long line of clerics and writers that trace themselves back to a Safavid era poet, Va'iz Qazvini. So, and her mother was a poet as well. And they were very much connected, as we all know, with this sort of sheikhi clerical establishment in Qazvin. So her scholarly side, which I think Hossein has also mentioned and others have mentioned here, she's not just sitting at home writing scholarly texts either. She is teaching basically at a university. So I think I'm not taking away from the radical nature of what she did, but it didn't just come out of nowhere. I think that streak is probably in the family, and it goes back. It goes back to her mother and her maternal uncle, and others who sort of created the conditions that made it possible for her to do what she did.
Oh, absolutely. She is madrasa trained and absolutely a scholar in her own right, and a teacher, a professor of women, of course, but later of men as well. The thing that interests me and fascinates me and confuses me, of course, is that Tahirih is very obviously willing to discard all that. I mean, and she does, and very dramatically and very, very outrageously, actually. She, being trained in this tradition, she's willing to dump it all in favor of a new age. And as a matter of fact, her theology, which we only know secondhand through the Kalantar himself, is that with the coming of the Qa'im, a new age has opened. The Sharia is abrogated. All religious obligations no longer apply. And we're in a new period in which we're waiting for the universal proclamation of a new age, or something like that. So that she completely discards Islam itself and the Sharia, which she had spent her life studying, in favor of the coming of a new age. And that's the other side of Tahirih, which is, they seem absolutely impossible to exist within the same person, but they do, which makes her the most fascinating
I
figure.
think,
And
though,
nobody
that
has yet.
probably Moujon's discovery of that encyclopedia.
Sorry?
Oh, well,
I-
I was just saying that I think Moujon's discovery of that encyclopedia article, which goes through Tahirih's family, and most especially that maternal line, is probably the most important contribution to scholarship on her that we've seen thus far. It sort of outdated my own article.
Sure.
Well, he was using, these Rijal texts that had been recently published and had a lot of information about the family and the genealogical links. So I would agree with Susan. And just in response to Tony, would that we would all have that kind of courage. So I completely agree.
Yes, Abbas Hamanat has also done a good deal of work on Tahirih and published some of it, though we wish he would publish more.
I did some research on the life of Tahirih, but my particular interest was to also find out that the contemporary to the life of Tahirih, what was happening in the Western world, in America and Europe. And it's amazing that you would find out around the same time that Tahirih was trailblazing in the East, there were women in the West, in America, the one who created the Christian Science Church, the Shaker movement, the Adventists, the woman like Sojourner Truth, woman like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So these were really all, my thesis was that there was a spirit of the age that moved this woman to be in the forefront of the religious and social movement.
Yeah, it didn't move anybody else in Iran, but I mean, any other women. But yes, I mean, she is outstanding and unusual even among Babis as seeing this new age rising. Even in Susan's article, where she quotes, Tahirih seeing Godus saying his obligatory prayer. And of course, she regarded this as useless. These religious obligations of Islam were completely abrogated, and there's no point in saying these prayers anymore. And she rushes out on horseback, apparently, in men's clothing, telling him this is not the time for prostrations, this is the time of battle, or words to that effect. Completely stunning, and it's kind of inexplicable, but there we have it.
Thank you, Tony. So I just want to say a couple of things. Wonderful presentations today. We still have a few more minutes left. There are a number of sources also put out by Abu Ghassan Afnan, kind of a couple of years ago in Farsi, that are kind of the 4 historical episodes that are really important. In fact, they do cast a kind of a new light in terms of her, a first-hand account of her martyrdom that actually is more accurate than the traditional ones that we kind of have seen. Again, the volume that now in its second edition that Adib and Nima have referred to is a very important volume. And in fact, it probably is, it is really in terms of what goes into it, how dense it is, it kind of really equals like resurrection and renewal. But it's pretty intense actually on the, you know, the author. And then there's also a fair amount of material by Fazana Milani, who studied her kind of to some extent and there's always been this debate between Fazana Milani and Abbas Amanat about, you know, is she more of a feminist or is she more of a kind of Bobby? And that's kind of interesting development. It kind of sidesteps the issue. I think that the issue really is that Tahirih is so complex, like from a literary point of view and from an Islamic scholarship point of view, from a Bobby point of view, from the fact that she was a feminist, that she had declared that she could determine what's pure and halal and haram. So she would basically change the whole landscape of that. Her act of courageousness in the field of picking up a sword. So I think in many aspects, Tahirih is understudied. And really, there's so many different facets to her that, you know, I think that Baha'i scholarship is going to struggle to get. There's also a very important book by the Azalis on the anniversary of her birth, published in Iran, Tahirih Nabaghi Qarn, which basically is available also on, which is kind of interesting take on there. And there's another book by Muinuddin Mehrabi, who also has it has kind of, I think, pro-Azali lineation, in which kind of has a book on Tahirih and poetry. So even from the poetry standpoint of view, there's a lot going on, and other aspects of Tahirih. So everything is pretty interesting as far as Tahirih. I have to also kind of mention that there's another kind of set of translation and scholarship on Tahirih's poetry in English by Hatcher and Hemmat.
Yes.
Correct. So they kind of came up from a different angle. Hatcher being a poet himself, really, and a professor of English, and Hemmat having done really good work on the scholarship of Tahirih. They put out 2 volumes. Actually, it's pretty good too. So anyway, so there's a lot of work to do, and I think I want to end right now by saying that also we are in the period of Badash right now, correct? So this July 18 date actually falls right in the middle of the period of Badasht, the Badash conference, what's known as the Badash conference for us. So anyway, so it was interesting that we had. I originally thought about this being about the Marlon Labab, but basically, it falls beautifully right in the middle of Badasht.
Yes, I could say also the Marxists in Iran claimed Tahirih, and Dr. Banani's article actually was partially and largely a refutation of the Marxist interpretation of Tahirih. Everybody has claimed her, and good for her. I mean, she is worth it. But Baha'is as well need to expand our perspective on Tahirih. One more thing, as long as there's going to be silences. A couple of years ago, there was a conference at UCLA on the 100th anniversary of the birth of 200th anniversary of the birth of the Bab, and a number of papers were offered. None of them were on Tahirih, but actually, I'm hoping, as Sholay knows quite well, to publish a book of the proceedings of that conference. Hint, hint. Anyway, there was a Marxist in the audience who stood up and quite angrily, when somebody mentioned Tahirih as Babi, said, "Who are you people to claim Tahirih? You don't have anything to do with Tahirih. She was a radical. She wanted to change things. You people are reactionaries and want to keep things the way they were," and so on. So they have a tradition, a Marxist tradition of Tahirih, which is very much in opposition to the Baha'i narrative.
There's even, I briefly mentioned this idea that the Baha'i teachings or the Babi teachings were being called socialist. in one of the newspaper references I have. That's happened a few times, actually.
Mhm. Socialist in the sense that they were radical, unconventional, outrageous.
Things like the equality of women and men.
Yeah, like that. That anything that is not mainstream must be, you must be a communist. That's sort of, and the same thing in Iran Matahedeh has pointed out, any unconventional behavior, dress, words, poetry is considered Babi. It has to be Babi because it's not mainstream.
I do want to share a comment in person as in closing.
Oh, I was just something off the top of my head. I recall reading a few years ago in doing some research on these fabrications and myths meant to discredit the Babi and Baha'i faiths. There was some correspondence found in some foreign office or other, and it was attributed either to a letter to Prince Dolgorukov, or maybe it was from him. And there was some fear and trepidation about this Babi movement being anarchist in nature, or communist, or maybe anarcho-communist. I can't quite remember how it was characterized, but yeah, even this extends very far back into history, I guess.
Yes, we know the Baha'i faith was either a Russian invention, or maybe an American invention, or maybe an Israeli plot, or something.
Or that a British traveler induced a teenage Mullah Hussein to coax the Bab into fabricating it.
Yeah,
religion,
the British
yeah.
must have done it, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, these tropes go all the way back really to the emergence of Shiism and Sunni attempts to explain it in many cases.
There's another parallel right there, right along with our first presentation by Stephen, because there is actually, or used to be, a video on YouTube alleging that Christianity was a Roman plot.
Yes, of course. Is Todd Lawson still here? I want to hear from him. Where is he?
No,
So he had to step out.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
he apologized in chat.
It's
All
like
right, guys, so we'll bring today to a close. Thank you so much, everyone. The presenters, the commentators, the recorders, the everyone. Love you all. And so our next one is due for the actually it's 4th Sunday in August. Where Todd Lawson and his friend, who used to be on the LSA of Mecca, this is kind of bizarre, actually will present. So we'll see everyone back then at that time. Okay.